Welcome. This video is documenting the prediction that famous singer-songwriter Paul Simon of Simon and Garfunkel will slip and fall and severely injure his head on December 19th, 2025. The post date on the social media platform that you are watching this video on proves that this prediction is being made ahead of time, as does this time-stamped email and forensic notes PDF document. If you are skeptical for some reason, please email me and I will forward these to you. If you have already watched this introductory information regarding November 27th, you can skip ahead no more than precisely 10 minutes. Welcome. This video that you are watching was produced prior to November 27th, 2025, when prior to this date, it was predicted that Paul Simon of Simon and Garfunkel, the famous singer and songwriter, would slip and fall and severely injure his head on this November 27th, 2025 date, Thanksgiving. This is because God's signs, his true big picture of signs, patterns, and connections, which is only being explained on this channel, overwhelmingly indicated that November 27th would be extremely important regarding this trail of signs leading to the date that Paul Simon will slip and fall and injure his head, which is now predicted to be December 19th, 2025, 22 days after November 27th. That's why the clear and relevant signs that occurred on November 27th that related to Paul Simon revealed adding 22 more days to reach December 19th. The signs we received on November 27th are explained in other videos in more detail. But for the sake of this introduction here, I will briefly describe them. But before I do, the key thing to understand here is that when Paul Simon slips and falls and injures his head on December 19th, it will prove that all of the analysis in this video for November 27th is 100% correct and true. That's the purpose of this prediction. In other words, the reason why God does this, why he lays out a trail of signs, it is in order to elaborate on the prophetic signs, because none of the prophetic signs can be properly or fully understood without their context and connections to the other prophetic signs. It is through these connections and context that God is able to tell these stories and themes. And God does this in order to relay extremely important information and knowledge that everyone needs to know. And everyone needs to know how and why God pointed in advance to November 27th, why he did so. And it is explained in these videos that talk about God pointing to November 27th. Now, the skeptic will say, oh, well, you know, he didn't slip and fall on that day. You were wrong. No. When the prediction comes to pass on December 19th, 22 days later, it will prove all of the analysis for November 27th. And therefore, it will prove that God was indeed pointing to November 27th regarding the slip and fall and injury of his head of Paul Simon. And therefore, all of the knowledge that's contained in these stories that were told in the lead up to November 27th are extremely important. And that's why when the prediction comes to pass, the wise person will recognize that they need to watch every minute of every video on this channel, including all of the videos that predicted November 27th. It was not quote unquote wrong. It was 100% correct. And that will be proven to be true when Paul Simon slips and falls and injures his head on December 19th. Now, why the 22 days from November 27th? Well, one of the signs we received on that day was the first American Pope's first trip abroad to 2 nations. And on the plane flight, the news story was that he was gifted the historic bat used by player number 2. The Chicago White Sox player number 2 was gifted to the Pope, the first American Pope, on his first trip abroad to 2 nations. There's much more to that. He was on, for example, his way to the 1700s anniversary celebration of the Nicene Creed. And on that day, one of the 2 National Guardsmen died, who was shot on 17th Street. And on, as explained in the other video. So we have the 2 and 2, number 2's bat and the 2-nation trip. The first American Pope from Chicago hints at the first black president from Chicago, and on and on. And the Pope and Obama are the 2 antichrists, except the first of the 2 antichrists, the Pope, is not Pope Leo, but will be Pope Francis, who will, or is predicted to become or be resurrected in April 2029. That's another subject. Okay, so we have, anyway, the 2 antichrists identified once again in God's signs. Now, Paul Simon was known to be an avid baseball fan. That's one reason why this is relevant. Also, his head injury is symbolic of people's heads being injured and their brains being injured from the things. You know what I'm talking about, the things. And the components in the things make their way to people's brains. And that will ultimately lead to demonic possession, and on, as explained in countless other Paul Simon videos. But the mark of the Antichrist, which is the thing, is symbolized by the number 22 in God's signs. And the Antichrists, the 2 Antichrists, will enforce the mark of the Antichrist. The reason why the mark of the Antichrist is symbolized by the number 22 is because the inverse of the mark of the Antichrist is described in the book of Ezekiel, which would have been a Tav mark, and the Tav letter in the Hebrew alphabet is the last and 22nd letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The mark of the Antichrist is described in the last and 22nd book out of 22 books in the Bible that have a total of 22 chapters. Also, the mark of the Antichrist alters a person's chromosomes, and chromosomes come in pairs, and each chromosome has 2 arms, and so 2 and 2, 22. Now, another sign we received on this date was the death of Fuzzy Zoeller, the famous Hall of Famer golfer, professional golfer, Fuzzy Zoeller, who was known for making, and never lived it down for the rest of his life, his racist comment after he had finished the Masters and while Tiger Woods was still playing the Masters on his way to winning his first Masters tournament. The first black player to win the Masters. Again, hints at the first black president Antichrist. Also, Tiger Woods is the GOAT, greatest of all time, and that hints at the GOAT Antichrist. Now, Fuzzy Zoeller was one of 2 players in the modern era to win the Masters in their first year as a professional. The other player was Tiger Woods. And Tiger Woods is known for his big comeback when he won the Masters 22 years after he first won the Masters in his first year as a professional. And so that's why the death of Fuzzy Zoeller also reveals adding 22 days. Now, there's so much more that's so amazing regarding all of this that is, for one thing, explained in the must-watch, as if all of them are must-watch, as you should know. 2 National Guardsmen shot, 2-nation trip by the Pope video regarding Paul Simon. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. That's the introduction here. Again, like I said, God was pointing to November 27th ahead of time. So the rest of this video will talk about how and why God pointed to November 27th ahead of time. And all of the analysis is 100% correct when the prediction comes to pass 22 days later on December 19th. And so Don't be confused when in this video later on I talk about how Paul Simon is predicted to slip and fall on November 27th. God was saying that. That's what God was saying. It was not, quote unquote, wrong, quote unquote. It was 100% correct. Okay, God was saying that Paul Simon would slip and fall on November 27th. But the way it works, and this is how it works, and I know far better than you or anyone how it works, is that it's not necessarily possible to know ahead of time, ahead of the date that God is pointing to, whether or not it will be the end of the trail of signs for that prediction or another step in the trail. And so November 27th was pointed to, and it was for Paul Simon's trail, and it ended up being a step. Now December 19th might be a step. But at this time, we're going to go with the prediction that Paul Simon will slip and fall and injure his head on December 19th. If it doesn't happen, you can rest assured there will be clear and relevant signs related to it on December 19th. And that said, enjoy the rest of the video. It must be watched. It's extremely important information, all of these videos. The sport of boxing is symbolic of war. Paul Simon performed The Boxer to open the first broadcast of Saturday Night Live in Manhattan after 9/11. Simon currently lives in Wimberley, Texas, near the site of the Battle of the Alamo, which ended after a long siege when the Mexican army finally breached the wall of security of the Alamo. H188 equals whoa exclamation mark. Okay, this is a number that God uses frequently in his signs. H188 in the Hebrew Concordance is the word for woe exclamation mark, which is used in the Bible in the context of extreme judgment from God. The only other time that a foreign enemy attacked the nation's capital on 9/11 was exactly 188 years earlier, when the British landed at Washington's Mount Vernon estate on the date 9/11 in 1813, and then proceeded to burn down the Capitol building and the White House, but not before Dolly Madison, the First Lady, famously rescued the portrait of George Washington. Okay, so what we have here is that Paul Simon sang The Boxer. Boxing is symbolic of war. He sang The Boxer to open the broadcast after 9/11, the first one. And he's predicted to fall and injure his head, and then die later. I just don't know the date yet. In Wimberley, Texas, which is right near the Battle of the Alamo, which is about war. Okay, and the siege of that Battle of the Alamo ended when the Mexican army finally breached the wall of security, which is why this is symbolic, because it aligns or parallels with the walls of security collapsing in God's judgment on the ancient city of Jericho when the Israelites took the promised land. And also, this is why the towers collapsed and engendered a small earthquake that cracked the foundation of Federal Hall on Wall Street, where, for example, George Washington was inaugurated, the first president. In other words, it was the cracking of the foundation of America, which is God, because George Washington, and after his inauguration, dedicated the nation to God in the chapel, which was the only building at Ground Zero to have survived the falling debris, and on and on. Okay, so anyway, this 188th anniversary on March 6th, 2024, of the wall of security being breached of the Alamo, okay, so that's March 6th, 2024, the 188th anniversary of the tragic end of the Battle of the Alamo, when the Mexican army breached the walls of security. Okay, now March 6th, 2024 was the day, and this date was known in advance that God was pointing it related to Paul Simon, okay? And so that's when we received the related signs that were clear, and this was the day that the Hotel California prophetic sign that was previously mentioned. Okay, so I talked about this earlier. If you're not watching these, if you're watching this video as an isolated video and not part of the whole video, and you're not watching these in chronological order, well, I don't know what to tell you. But anyway, I've talked about the Hotel California sign already, but it's symbolic of Paul Simon because it's a hotel and whatever. So anyway, So March 6, 2024 was 119% of a calendar year, which hints at 9/11, before a vintage Mexican warship crashed into the Brooklyn Bridge between Manhattan and Brooklyn, Queens. Now, this is amazing because, again, this was a Paul Simon sign, all right? As I explained before, the Hotel California sign, let me just, I guess, say it was the day that the court in New York, speaking of 9/11, threw out the case in which the leader of the band, the Eagles, was suing a few other journalists that were in possession of his original handwritten letters and accused them of stealing them and trying to sell them and whatnot. But, and so they're both baby boomer singers. It was, the siege in the Alamo was 13 days. It was 13 days after the 13-year-old owl died after it crashed its head into the tower in Central Park. Paul Simon sang in the reunion concert with Garfunkel 9 months and 11 days in Central Park after John Lennon was shot next to Central Park, and on and on. Okay, so anyway, so just take my word for it. It was the prophetic sign. It's relevant, but it's a 9/11 sign too because as I just explained there, it connected with the owl. That was a 9/11 sign, and again, on Paul Simon's new album is a depiction of owls. Okay. And, well, anyway, so Simon grew up in Queens. We have this vintage, old Mexican warship, like sailing ship, that crashed into the Brooklyn Bridge. And that rhymes with the old Mexican army at the Battle of the Alamo. In fact, you know what? I should really look up as to the year that this Mexican warship would have been in use in battle. Let me just check. Now, I just learned some interesting things. Yes, I was correct. Of course, it makes sense. The Mexican ship is a replica of the ship in use in 1825, which would have only been 12 years after the Mexican army at the Battle of the Alamo. No, I'm sorry. The Battle of the Alamo was in 1836, so it was only 9 years before the Battle of the Alamo. So it predates the Battle of the Alamo. We have some other interesting things here about the ship. It was scheduled to visit 22 ports in 15 nations, and it slammed into the Brooklyn Bridge. B is the second letter of the alphabet. So 2 and 2, Brooklyn Bridge. And Paul Simon is Jewish, and he's from Queens, and there are a lot of Jews in Brooklyn. But also, BB hints at the leader of Israel currently. Anyway, that's just interesting side notes. But anyway, the point is that the 22 ports in 15 nations hints at Paul Simon because we're talking about the Owl album, the 7 Psalms, which is his 15th solo album. And the reason why Paul Simon will fall and injure his head is because it points to the mark of the Antichrist, which is symbolized by the number 22. Because people will become demonically possessed through their brains because of the things that are inside the thing that are put inside of them, and that will trigger delta brainwaves and demonic possession. And the demonic possession will be a result of demons coming through the porthole that's described in the book of Revelation, which is symbolized by Revelation 9, verse 11, 9:11. And King Apollyon, and that's why the king fell and hit his head in this mansion. But it's the hitting of the head is symbolic of the brain injury that Paul Simon will receive, which will in turn be symbolic of the demonic possession through people's brains. And so that's why 22 ports, because it's 22 portholes. And the number 22 symbolizes the mark of the Antichrist. Because the inverse of the mark of the Antichrist described in the book of Ezekiel would have been a Tav mark. The Tav is the 22nd and last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and the mark of the Antichrist is described in the last book of the Bible, which is the 22nd book out of 22 books in the Bible that have a total of 22 chapters. And also, the mark of the Antichrist changes a person's chromosomes, and chromosomes come in pairs, and each chromosome has 2 arms, and so 2 and 2. Okay, so that's another interesting thing about the ship. It's also Paul Simon related. All right, so getting back to what I was saying, Paul Simon performed the first broadcast, The Boxer, after 9/11. Boxing is symbolic of war, And he's predicted to, crash and fall in Wimberley near the Battle of the Alamo, and there's more signs to confirm that relevance, that connection. This is just a superficial summary of the big picture. This isn't really, I can't explain everything in every video, right? So, and it's so infinite. And so anyway, we've also got the Battle of the Alamo sign on the 188th anniversary with the Hotel California. And there was another sign on that day too, the announcement that the Doobie Brothers would get together for their first album in 44 years, since that would include the focus on Michael McDonald. And the Doobie Brothers have an album that, I forget the name of it, that's under a bridge, but was broken in the most consequential earthquake ever in California, as in Hotel California. And this is the overpass that was that collapsed due to the earthquake. But underneath that, in the cover art for this album, is the Doobie Brothers on a stagecoach with 4 horses, which hints at the 4 horses of the apocalypse in the book of Revelation. And again, Paul Simon performed 4 days after 9/11. Yes, here it is. You can see it. This isn't the best image. Let me see if you can see it here. Okay, yes, this is it's the captain and me. This was after the 1971 earthquake. They've got the 4 horses, the stagecoach. It's just astounding. But we've got this broken bridge, and of course this hints at Paul Simon too, because of his song "Bridge Over Troubled Water," which is in turn symbolic of the bridge that the demons will cross through the portal over into the earthly realm, and then demonically possess people through their heads, which is why Paul Simon will have a head injury. Okay, so back to what I was saying here. Simon grew up in Queens, and he sang about the area of Queens in his hit song, "Me and Julio Down by the Schoolyard." Okay, so not only is Paul Simon from Queens, it's part of his music and his repertoire of hits that he would perform at concerts, etc. One of Simon's biggest hits is "Bridge Over Troubled Water," and he has another hit named 59th Street Bridge. And again, this ship hit this Mexican warship hit the Brooklyn Bridge. But again, the Mexican warship is relevant because of the Mexican army at the Battle of the Alamo. It's just astounding. God is the master creator of creative artist here. The Twin Towers were 110 stories high before they collapsed and after being struck by planes on 9/11. The 110th mayor of New York City spoke to the press at 9 p.m. after 1+1 people died when the Mexican warship struck the Brooklyn Bridge, which makes it a 9/11 sign, which in turn makes it a Revelation 9/11 sign, which is part of the Paul Simon signs, because of the bridge that the demons will cross in the trumpet judgment, symbolized by Revelation 9/11. The trumpet judgments follow the sound of silence in heaven, and that's why Paul Simon's first hit was Sound of Silence. So, and it was the 110th mayor. It was 110 stories, of course, that collapsed on 9/11, but 110 also hints at 11. And the 110th mayor spoke at 9 p.m. after 1+1 people died, which also hints at 9/11. Okay, and music, by the way, is frequencies, which is what will trigger the delta brainwaves in people's brains, which will facilitate demonic possession, which is why the first line of Paul Simon's Graceland song is "The Mississippi Delta was shining like a national guitar," because shining is symbolic of demonic possession, as the movie The Shining is about demonic possession. And Paul Simon famously dated Shelley Duvall and broke up with her at the airport before she flew to the UK to film the movie. In other words, the Mexican army in 1836 connected with the vintage Mexican warship through Paul Simon. In the Bible, 276 souls survived after the ship Paul, which hints at Paul Simon, was traveling on, crashed into a reef. The Mexican warship crashed its mastheads into the bridge on May 17th, 2025. 27 weeks and 6 days, which hints at 276, before the predicted news on November 28th that Paul Simon has crashed to the ground and severely injured his head. If you didn't catch that, mastheads also hints at Paul Simon's head injury when he crashes to the ground. And the mastheads crashed into the bridge. Paul Simon, Bridge Over Troubled Water, 59th Street Bridge, which, by the way, is a bridge that connects the Manhattan Island to over the East River, just like the Brooklyn Bridge. Okay, 27 weeks and 6 days. It's amazing because that number symbolizes ships. But also, one of the trumpet judgments is the destruction of ships in Revelation chapter 8. And the ships in that chapter symbolize America, and I won't get into that. I've explained it too many other times in other videos. But there are people that say that America isn't in Bible prophecy, but that is incorrect because the ships symbolize America. Well, since we're talking about ships, I should probably just try to explain it briefly here again. Isaiah chapter 23 talks about the judgment on ancient Tyre, and Tarshish, and Tyre, and the daughter of Tarshish. Well, we know from evidence from history that Tarshish referred to Great Britain. And Great Britain's power and how it became the dominant empire of the 19th century on which the sun never set, which God used as the cross-pollinator of cultures around the world and spread the gospel through, was a result of its naval power and its ships and its merchant navy as well. And Great Britain birthed America, and likewise its power was a result of its ships. And also, God separated Great Britain from the rest of Europe with an ocean, and that's why it relates to ancient Tyre, because ancient Tyre's prosperity and power were a result of its natural protection of being an island off the coast in the Mediterranean, which wasn't conquered until Alexander the Great built a bridge, a causeway bridge from the mainland to the island. And so that's why in God's signs, Tyre is symbolic of America. Well, anyway, that's why one of the Paul Simon signs was the Tyre-Kill mansion fire, which was expected in advance of the date that it occurred on, which was January 3rd, 2025. Anyway, So a lot of the prophecy in the book of Revelation is actually a parallel with the Old Testament prophecy, including in the book of Isaiah, in this case, the ships of Tarshish and the daughter of Tarshish and her ships. This is why the ships that are destroyed, because it's not just random. Why would God put the destruction of ships into this passage if it were just for amusement or interesting imagery? It's not just for interesting imagery. It's because God is pointing to America symbolically through the ships. So in other words, the destruction of the ships is symbolic of the destruction of America, which will begin after the death of Paul Simon, because Paul Simon will be the bookend to the warning of judgment after 9/11, which is why Paul Simon performed right after 9/11 and will die at the end of this period of warning that was 9/11. And that's why his fourth album book ends with the song America, because Paul Simon's death will be the bookend to the warning of the opportunity to repent, which has slidden away for America, which is why Paul Simon's song Slip, Slide, and Away is from his fourth solo album. Because of the 4 days after 9/11, after he performed The Boxer, which is and boxing is about trying to knock the opponent down and have him collapse on the mat, which is why the towers collapsed on 9/11, and then Paul Simon sang The Boxer. Okay, so, all right, so anyway, see what I'm saying? You know, it's impossible to explain his big picture of signs without going off onto these tangents to try to explain it even more of what I'm talking about. Because it can't just download everything. It's three-dimensional. Just like the Bible isn't a linear document. It's three-dimensional. Even just explaining the principle of how God's signs works requires going off onto a tangent, okay? So the big picture of signs is a three-dimensional big picture, a web, and likewise, so is the Bible. And one can take an infinite number of pathways through the Bible, and it's not meant to be understood linearly, and everything interconnects with everything else, just like God's big picture of signs. Okay, and speaking of which, the 276 ships, which is why, and the date 1128 hints, as I explained earlier, the 11-ship flotilla and Winthrop's sermon derived from Deuteronomy chapter 28, which is another reason why God uses ships to symbolize America, because it's all about the founding of America with ships, the Mayflower and the 11-ship flotilla. And the Mayflower had 101 passengers, and anchored for the first time on the date 1111 after the 11th triangular number of days crossing the Atlantic. And so anyway, so the date 1128 hints at this. Well, I was jumping ahead actually, because it really is all about the ships symbolizing America. It's not so God knew that the Mayflower and the 11th ship flotilla would symbolize America even before Isaiah wrote about the ships and the ships of Tarshish, which is Great Britain, which is essentially America, at least culturally, inherited culture. And so the date 1128 hints at the sermon derived from Deuteronomy chapter 28 that Winthrop delivered to the Puritans in the 11-ship flotilla, which is why Paul Simon's news of his fall was predicted to occur on this date. On 9/11, the Flight 11 airship with a crew, and that's another thing. The airships on 9/11 point to the ships that founded America, the spiritual founding of America, which was the only other time a nation was founded in the history of the world on God and the Bible, the other being Israel. On 9/11, the Flight 11 airship with a crew of 11 struck the towers that looked like a giant 11 in the 11th state after departing Governor's Island in Boston, which was named after the first governor of Boston Colony, John Winthrop, who resided there and prayed to God there. I just want to add that this Mexican warship that I had mentioned a minute ago hinted at the mark of the Antichrist, the injection, which again is related to Paul Simon because of the mastheads that were crashed into the bridge and the demonic possession of those who take the mark from the demons that cross over the bridge, and Paul Simon's head injury because demons will possess people through their brains, and Paul Simon saying bridge over troubled water. Again, this ship was scheduled to go to 22 ports. And as I explained, it was the Brooklyn Bridge, BB, B second letter, 22, symbolizing the mark of the Antichrist. One thing to add, which I forgot to add, so I have to bring it up here again at the end of the video, is that God is using these names of things with the letter X in them because the X is symbolic of the mark. So it's Mexican, it's Mexico, and the reason why the X is symbolic of the mark is because, well, it's obvious because it's an X, it's a mark. X marks the spot, but also the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is symbolic of the mark, because of the inverse of the mark of the Antichrist in Bible prophecy, the Tav letter, which was an X in Paleo-Hebrew. So in other words, the Tav mark in the book of Ezekiel is an X. And again, the reason why the number 22 is symbolic of the mark is because the Tav letter in the Hebrew alphabet is the last and 22nd letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Again, the mark of the Antichrist is described in the last book of the Bible, which is the 22nd book out of 22 books in the Bible that have a total of 22 chapters. And again, the mark of the Antichrist changes a person's chromosomes, and chromosomes come in pairs, and each chromosome has 2 arms, and so 2 and 2.